Ross is not here today, but Mirjana's replacing him for the episode, which we are talking about. That's the worst thing, the worst language I've ever used. I'm gonna have to cut this part out. Welcome to Screens of the Stone Age, the podcast where scientists review movies about prehistoric people. My name is Josh Lindell. I'm a grad student studying Neanderthal teeth, and I'm here with...
I'm Dr. Kim Plomp. I am a bioarchaeologist. I study the human skeleton, health and disease, and evolution.
And I am Professor Mirjana Roksandic. I study human evolution and bioarchaeology.
Ross is away today, but Mirjana is replacing him to discuss an episode of the TV show Bones called The Archaeologist in the Cocoon. This is season 8, episode 11. And I invited you, Mirjana, specifically because you taught me forensics and you taught me human evolution. And this episode covers both. Kim just told me she's never watched Bones before. Mirjana, have you watched Bones before?
This was my first immersion into it, and...
Yeah, I don't want to do it again.
I can't believe neither of you have watched Bones. I used to watch Bones all the time. Kind of, not really hate watch, but like, watch it to laugh at it and make fun of it. But I enjoy it.
Puzzle watch. No, how can you enjoy it? It's so cliche, but okay.
Yeah.
Well, what other show is going to include a story about forensic anthropologists investigating a murder at the same time as trying to solve the mystery of an interspecies Neanderthal modern human family? That no other show would do that.
I know, but maybe it's good that they don't.
Yeah.
So we usually start off with a summary of the movie, or the episode in this case. Mirjana, could you provide us with a summary of this episode?
Okay, so a very smart and competitive forensic anthropologist who was previously academic doing human evolution is called to examine a crime. They found an archaeologist decomposing in a cocoon. There's some nice scenes of corvids cleaning the bones. We'll talk about that later. And then the younger, her former student, now a full-fledged anthropologist in FBI, examines the bones that the person found, the archaeologists have found, and brought from Chechnya, Chechnya. And he discovers that these belong to a family of Neanderthal father, I believe, and Homo sapiens mother, and the child, and they all died from violent interactions. So, in the meantime, she discovers that the forensic anthropologist, on the other hand, figures out that this was actually a murder of a person, not by his lover or the lover's brother, but that it was his publisher that killed him. So, in a nutshell, publisher killed an archaeologist who, by the way, has a lot of issues with ethics, but we'll talk about that. All right.
Yes.
Is that a good summary? No, I don't know.
Yeah, it's what I usually give.
It's a pretty short episode. We normally do movies. Last one we did was like 2 hours and 40 minutes, but this one's only like 42 minutes long.
But it felt like 4 hours.
There's a lot of details to talk about.
It was trying to write all of these things, you know. I was trying to write them down, and I had to go back, you know, and scroll back to hear what she actually said, like Caucasoid male. I was like dying.
I don't usually take notes, but this time I took a couple just because everything was so stupid. I was like, I have to remember that. That's so dumb.
I have a whole list of them, so I'll open my little notebooks.
The reason I always like watching this show is because it's so dense with like little tidbits of real information that you can criticize. So we always start off by nitpicking the scientific inaccuracies. I think we could probably spend our whole episode just talking about these little inaccuracies in the details.
I wouldn't say little. So what gets me about these shows, what I can't stand about them, and it was kind of similar with Gilmore Girl and stuff like that, is that they just use this like pseudo intellectual jargon all the time to make it sound like the person is so smart that they can't speak normally. And it's supposed to make them sound really smart, but it doesn't. It just makes them sound insecure, right? And like an example is when the forensic anthropologist is arguing with the paleoanthropologist, and so she says, "Oh, you said this," and he was like, "That's an inaccurate representation of what I had said." And you're like, "You wouldn't say that. You would say, that's not what I said," right? Like,
well, he's talking to his former professor, so from now on, Josh, when you say something, this is how you should talk.
It has to have at least like 13 more syllables than it should.
Yeah, that's not what I said.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we just go straight through this episode? We'll start with the crime scene right away, where they find a body, which turns out to be an archaeologist, but it's not really an archaeologist. He's actually a pseudo-archaeologist.
Yes.
But they find him wrapped up in a cocoon from some sort of silkworms or something.
Which didn't even end up being a major part of the story.
Yeah, I didn't think about that, but there's really no reason.
Right? Like, they just kind of forgot about the whole cocoon part. It was so weird, and they never came back to it. Like, it never helped them solve the crime. It really had nothing to do with it. They didn't explain any of it.
I guess it makes a catchy title for the episode.
And gross way of finding, like, can you imagine someone's falling down with a parachute? Like, did you notice this trope?
Yeah.
Like, he's falling down with a parachute, ends up seeing the cocoon. It's like, okay.
And then do insects make cocoons like that large enough for humans? I don't think so.
Well, I don't think it was really a cocoon. The worms that they were talking about were, they called them Hyphantria cunea, which is the fall webworm, which is native to North America. So that much it kind of checks out. And they're the ones that spin these like long stringy things that like wrap up all these branches in the trees. So I don't know. I've seen pictures of like, I think it was in India where they have these like maybe spiders or some kind of worms or something that like wrap entire trees in silk. So I suppose that's possible. I don't think there's any specific reason why they'd wrap up a body in a tree. But anyway, I don't think there's too much of a problem with those worms, except that the actual worms that they showed, the actual worms that they showed later were not Hyphantria cunea. I think they were just like mealworms. But I guess that's okay.
I mean, where are they going to find that whatever hydrantria is you're talking about in such quantities, and reproduce them so that they can have corvids eating on them? That's such a beautiful scene. I mean, that's...
But they wouldn't do that in a forensic case. The crows would...
of course they wouldn't do that.
God.
So they would do absolutely none of it.
They would put the cocoon in this, like, glass box thing so they can observe it, and then they're like, well, how are you going to get rid of all the worms? And so he released like 5 crows into the box to eat the worms. It was ridiculous.
Well, it sounded gory. I mean, this is all about the effect it will have on the population. So one of the first things that she's like, she goes there and she cuts a sample, right? She cuts it right above her face. So it's like, analyzing a sample from side would have been much nicer. But then she gets all the worms on her face and it's like, wow, great job, young woman.
Oh. And then she looks at the cranium and she's like, oh, slanted forehead, so it must be Caucasian.
That's like brow ridges, strong brow ridges and slant.
So you guys haven't seen Bones before, but this is basically, there's a formula to the show. The first thing is there's some strange random scene where somebody finds a body through some crazy happenstance, like parachuting and landing in a tree, and then there's a body in a cocoon in the tree, right? Then the FBI comes in and Bones investigates, and she looks at one feature of the skeleton and identifies its sex and its ancestry.
Do you remember that, I've never watched Bones before, but I know of her from a forensic science meeting, the meeting of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, where she presented a work which was okay. I mean, none of this fancy stuff. And then everyone at the conference was talking about how she actually made it big with these books and the TV series. And I was like, wow, what a lucrative way. But I mean, that a forensic scientist can write any of that is, it just doesn't check, because, I mean, she wouldn't unless she's just throwing nonsense out just to please the audience. So I don't think she's the one making those screenplays.
No, she must have stepped back. But I haven't read the book, so I don't know how accurate the books are. Like if the books are more scientific or not, I don't know.
Yeah, so the forensic anthropologist we're talking about is Kathy Reichs, right?
Yeah.
Kathy Reichs writes a series of books which the show Bones is based on, and they're really popular. I was at a thrift store just last weekend, and there were tons of her books in that series there. So I don't know how much influence she has on each individual episode, but I'm pretty sure she's like an executive producer on the show or something like that.
So she would have a final say. I know she wrote some of them, but so this nonsense about, and I always tell my students, okay, so don't do like Bones does, throws a glance at the body and says, oh, 34-year-old killed by a jealous husband, So incredible overinterpretation galore.
Yeah, so she says prominent brow ridge and slanted frontal bone indicates the victim is a Caucasian human male. So the prominent brow ridge is... Well, yeah. But relative to the scope of modern human skeletons, a prominent brow ridge would be an indicator of a male. But if you include like an assessment of the entire skeleton and look at that all in context. But I didn't understand the slanted frontal bone. Is this like a slanted frontal bone combined with a prominent brow ridge would indicate male compared to a female that would have a more vertical frontal bone? But I don't know where the Caucasian comes from. Is the slanted frontal bone supposed to indicate that he's Caucasian?
No such thing. So
yeah, she's taking like the tiniest little bit of reality and like again extrapolating it to, but it's a show, so they have to do that really quickly. They can't have them sit there for an hour and assess the entire skeleton to determine. But then again, The skeleton wasn't skeletonized. It had a lot of soft tissue, so they probably could have figured out if it was male or female from the soft tissue, right? Oh, there's another thing. She's looking at this body that is covered in soft tissue, and she says the prominent brow ridge and slanted frontal bone indicate this, but she can't see the bones because it still has soft tissue over it, right?
Yep.
Okay, and then they bring the body back to the lab. They want to get rid of the soft tissue or they want to get rid of the worms which are covering it. So they put it in a box full of crows, which are supposed to eat the worms. But why wouldn't we use crows to do that?
Well, it's going to disturb. I mean, I was like half expecting that later they're going to be like, seems that he died from an inordinate amount of pecking and scratching.
That was my thinking. Like, how in the world did he not see those marks from the crows?
Yes.
I'm sure crows eat worms, but they also scavenge for dead carcasses, so they would just eat that body.
They're just going to make a mess. Yes.
And that also, there is like enough soft tissue for her to take an organ of some kind out of the body. And I don't know, do what with it? Just show it to the audience, like, oh, this is what we do on a regular basis in forensic cases. Like, oh, yeah, it's awesome. It's just...
Well, one of the realistic things about bones is that forensic anthropologists focus on bones, right? Like, if you have a body, it doesn't go to a forensic anthropologist. It goes to like a coroner or medical examiner. No. So they always have to strip the body of its flesh before bones can actually analyze it. But they always come in so fully fleshed that they're like stripping away the entire flesh. They should just be sending these bodies to the coroner instead of sending them to a forensic anthropologist in most cases in this show.
So this is not, that's not a mistake, okay? So in Canada, we don't send it to forensic anthropologists unless it's skeletonized already, okay? But in US, most of the cases go directly to forensic anthropologists, and I have no clue why they do that.
Really?
But
I didn't even think there were that many forensic anthropologists.
Oh my God, in Florida, like they have so many cases. We had a colleague from North Dakota, Phoebe, but I forgot her last name right now. I'm blanking because it's too early in the morning. But she was telling us when she worked as a forensic anthropologist in Florida, they had cases on, like they have lots of different cases. There's lots of murder, basically. And they get all sorts of fleshed bones and then they decompose them. I'm like, why do they not use soft tissue to analyze pathologies and stuff like that? And then she's like,
It's like removing all of the evidence just to get to something that has a little bit less evidence.
Yeah. So it's that part is not inaccurate. It's unfortunate and stupid, but not inaccurate. The show is on Fox. Does that strike you as weird?
No, not after watching it. No.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So this guy is an adventure type who goes to, and offhand she mentions that he was with cannibals in New Guinea.
Mm-hmm.
That's also like one of these, like, oh, so great. Like
he writes books about dinosaur eggs and Maya civilization, and it was all the pseudo-archaeology stuff that he has written books on. And then from each book, he sells an artifact to one guy from the book.
He's essentially Graham Hancock. We can't escape Graham Hancock these days, but he is essentially a fictionalized version of Graham Hancock.
Yes.
But the weird thing about him is that even though he's a pseudo-archaeologist writing about all these conspiracy theories, for some reason he wants to be a real archaeologist, and he has found real archaeological remains, which he has smuggled into the country, and then he told his publisher, I don't want to write pseudo-archaeology anymore, I want to get published in a real academic journal, and that's why she murdered him.
God,
because he wanted to publish in an academic journal instead of publish pseudo-archaeology with her.
That part is the best, actually.
In a stupid journal is not going to pay him.
Right. So that's the part that I like the best. He gets killed for doing real archaeology for once in his life. But, these ethical issues around the smuggling and the selling and, destroying sites because he's not in proper archaeological excavations is beyond belief, right? But of course, there has to be a stupid Russian in this show. Like Americans are so predictable. I mean, all of this is really a strong level. Like whatever you watch coming out of that country that's popular is such a propaganda machine. It's just dying. It's just killing me, But the stupid Russian woman who speaks English but doesn't want to, because when she gets emotional, she goes to Russian. And then he doesn't understand her, like, okay. First of all, I heard that he's from Czech Republic outside of Grozny. But then I was like, no, that's... But then they say Chechnya, so I was like, okay. So I thought maybe they didn't check their geography properly.
And they say they didn't.
Wouldn't surprise me. And then he's asking, like, you killed him, right? To preserve your family honor. So, okay, maybe he's mixing the Russians with the Chechens and, just basically having this stereotype of a dumb...
Well, I think it was, non-American.
No, it's always, it has to be Russian. It cannot be Chinese because for lots of reasons. But I mean, have you noticed, for example, Koreans, okay, in Lucy, they get this rap and it's just unbelievable. Like, okay, in Lucy, you have a whole bunch of French police not being able to stop the rampage of 5 Korean mafioso in the middle of Paris. Okay, French police, on the other hand, are totally incapable when compared to Americans. Russians are stupid, Koreans are bloodthirsty. Like, you have those tropes, and they go through all sorts of their cinema. But yeah, back to, there is enough on the scientific part that is really crazy.
You're always talking about Lucy. We're going to have you on for an episode to talk about that.
No. That's enough. There is no reason to watch it. And you can't make an episode that just has one thing, of Lucy.
We've probably made an episode on less.
Yeah, I think we have. I think my favorite part of the show, well, I have two favorite parts. One is when they find the bones, the fossils in his storage unit, which is a no-no, right? Like if he was a real archaeologist, they would be handled properly and in an institute or in a research facility. They wouldn't just be in his private collection, being in a storage unit. But when she sees the bones, she automatically just picks up what looks like an ulna and just licks it to her tongue.
I thought it was a radius that she was taking.
It might have been radius. Yeah. And so they get that because in the field, archaeologists, we do lick to tell the difference between rocks and bones. Bones are more porous, and so if you lick it, it's going to stick to your tongue a little bit more than rock. But we don't do that with an obvious bone. I wouldn't pick up a femur and lick it, right? Like, she's a forensic anthropologist. She knows she's not trying to decide the difference between, well, she said animal bone and human bone, but she isn't like, she would be able to glance at it and see. And you also can't lick animal bone and human, like the bones are porous. It's the difference between rocks and bones that you lick it for. But yeah, so it was just ridiculous that she did that, especially as a forensic anthropologist who at that point doesn't necessarily know that they're not a forensic situation. So she's just got her DNA all over it too, right? Like the forensic anthropologist walks in and starts licking the bones.
Yeah, it should be obvious to anybody that this doesn't make any sense just because of how inconsistently it's used in the media. Like sometimes it's to tell the difference between bone and rock, but sometimes it's to tell the difference between human and animal bone. So both of those can't be true at the same time, right?
Yeah.
But there is some truth to the idea that human and non-human bone have different porosities and therefore they would stick to your tongue differently.
Definitely. But that's not really what we use to decide between the two. Yeah,
in practice, if you look at the bone, you can just tell by looking at it.
Yes. Especially that big of a fragment, like it wasn't just a little tiny piece.
But why is it that human bone is a different porosity than animal bone? That's one of the weirdest things to me because like there's really nothing special about a human skeleton compared to an animal skeleton.
There is when you look into the way the osteons are packed in
which are bone cells.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you should remember. Oh, yeah, right. Sorry, I was not talking to the audience. I was talking to Josh. You should remember that. Okay, so the way the osteons are packed in humans is like in a honeycomb fashion, and the way they're packed in most animals is this plaque fashion. So there is a little bit more sheen and a little bit more density to the cortical bone of the animals and not humans.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a reason for that, but it would be overrun by the fact that they are like probably by that time either porous because they are too long in the ground, or they are already on the process of fossilization, which is replacement of the basically organic matter with stone. So
yes, that's the other thing is, yeah, these bones also weren't bones at this point, they were fossils.
No one would go anywhere near forensic bones without the full equipment or Paleolithic bones. And how does she know that they're Paleolithic right off the top of her head? Like, this is like...
Well, it tasted like it. Tastes about 25,000 years, give or take.
Yeah, something like that, right? So it was like, whoa, boy, oh boy. And she worked on Legarvelho, the site in Portugal. That's what she said. That's how she made her career. Not bad.
Ridiculous.
I don't know what Josilhão would say about that. He must be like, oh my God, no, not her.
No.
Okay, so what is this site in Portugal, and why is it important in paleoanthropology, and how does it serve as an inspiration for this episode? Because there's a few things in real life that serve as an inspiration for the story in this episode.
Well, that's a child that's supposed to be a very, very late Neanderthal occurrence in Europe, and possibly, and I actually would say now, accepted as an evidence of intermixture or admixture between Neanderthals and modern humans. When it was first published, they didn't have DNA evidence for, so for the longest time, or not longest time, but let's say we go through this like kind of click clock, metronome kind of science. At some point we think Neanderthals were human, not human, human, not human. So at some point we think they mated with modern humans, they did not. And, so you go with how the evidence changes and how interpretation changes. It goes back and forth, right? So at the time when Legarvelho was found, which was really a fascinating site, they didn't have genetic evidence for admixture with modern humans, and for 30 years they strongly believed that there was no admixture between modern humans and Neanderthals, also based on genetic evidence. Morphological evidence, interpreted by a number of our colleagues, was that yes, there must have been some admixture in Europe, but genetic evidence was adamant that no. And so what happened is that when Legarvelho was found, they claimed it to be a Neanderthal and possibly Neanderthal modern human hybrid very late in terms of European archaeology, because Neanderthals go extinct basically by 40,000. So yeah, it is an interesting site, yeah, and it clicks in with this episode because the child is an mixed person.
And then another thing, so this episode is from 2013, and the context that this episode came out in is in 2010, they published the draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome, which proved that there was admixture between Neanderthals and modern humans, and specifically that most living modern humans have some Neanderthal genes and therefore have at least one Neanderthal ancestor at some point.
Most living modern humans outside of Africa, so who are not of African origin.
So the idea that you could find a family of Neanderthals and modern humans living together was suddenly a reality at this point, but they hadn't actually found any yet. But since 2013, we've found a lot of evidence that is very similar to what they're finding here. So I think the most interesting one, or the most close to the story, is in 2018, they published a DNA from a bone that had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. So it's not a modern human, but it's a first-generation hybrid of a Neanderthal and another type of human called the Denisovans. And they could tell this from the DNA. It had exactly 50% Neanderthal DNA and 50% Denisovan DNA. So it's not a family of skeletons buried together like in the show, but it's essentially the same thing. We clearly had two different types of people coming together and having a child together. And then there are also many different sites where we've found modern human bones with more Neanderthal DNA than we would expect to find in humans living today. So in some cases, they can use this to estimate how far back that person had a Neanderthal ancestor. And in several cases, it would have been maybe 4 to 6 generations. So how many sites do we have? There's Peștera cu Oase in Romania, where we have a skull that had a Neanderthal great-great-great-great-grandparents. There's Bachokiro in Bulgaria. Is that where that is?
Yeah.
What other sites do we have where we have evidence of recent Neanderthal ancestors in modern human remains?
You're putting me on the spot right now.
They're also new, though. Like, these papers are all since 2015. Bachokiro is 2021, I think.
Yeah, I don't think that you have too many of them. I mean, I think more admixture was found with Denisovans, especially in the Denisova cave. But there is enough to say that we have, and there is also some that indicated there is some intermixed ancestry from a yet unidentified early human species. So the admixture among humans in this time period was much wider than we initially thought. So whenever they were at the interaction zone, they would actually, they mated, they had their own, they interacted and they had children.
And we know all this from DNA, but what are the chances that we're going to do like in the show where we find 3 skeletons and we can determine that one is a Neanderthal father and one's a modern human mother and the child is a hybrid and they all lived and died together and then we find them all buried together? What are the chances that we could ever do that?
Okay, chances are very slim. Especially because this burial is a deliberate, the burial that they show is a deliberate burial, right?
Mm-hmm.
And these people were presumably killed. And,
Yeah.
and that they somehow ended up being buried together in a nice pose, right? With the child as well. The child came in and hugged the mom and then finally died of starvation, right? But the one thing, did you notice how she knows that it's a Neanderthal child that mixed?
How?
Because he knows. This is the anthropologist, the young guy. He figures out that the child is an admixed Neanderthal modern human child because the illustrator has made it with shorter tibias than what would be expected. And she's like, you made a mistake here. The tibias are too, like, the legs are too short. And she's like, no, this is based on your measurement. And
Oh my goodness.
That's the funny thing too. They're building a museum diorama at the same time as they're doing this analysis of the remains. And the analysis is so superficial, but they're reconstructing the like cave site where they found the people at the same time as doing it. And then they present their results within this diorama. And it's so weird that people might think that's how science is done, that we're just like art students that come up with cool stories.
and enacted in the end, you know.
Yeah. Yes. And also all the evidence or all the details that they know about these bones comes from these guys' notes. And he wasn't a trained archaeologist or paleoanthropologist. And all of his books and publications to date have been pseudo-archaeology. So there'd be no reason to assume that what he was writing or saying was accurate. And so, yeah, it's just silly.
No, he was a trained archaeologist, but he found a path outside of academia, you know. I mean, academia is so difficult, you know, that it's not for the kind. Yeah, so, you know, baking
bread.
But
if John Hancock just wrote like a paper that, or had archaeological evidence or something, I would be suspicious of it.
Graham Hancock. John Hancock was a signer of the Declaration of Independence.
Right. Well, either way, I would be either one.
Neither of them qualifies as a trained archaeologist, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the injuries that these skeletons have sustained.
Oh,
so
the
first thing is they can reconstruct the events because of injuries to these skeletons. They say that there is a nick on the coracoid process of the father. The coracoid process is part of the shoulder blade. But they
then
say
she shows an ulna. No. She's showing a humerus with a medial condyle of nipped off, right? This is fantastic, actually.
And then they say the coracoid process could only be exposed if the arm was raised, as if the victim was fending off an attack. So I was trying to imagine, I can't imagine this, but the coracoid process is kind of deep inside your shoulder. And I don't know if you're stabbing somebody deep into their shoulder, whether or not the arm needs to be up or down, if that makes a difference.
Yeah, that didn't make sense to me. They also said that they had green stick fractures.
Yeah, the father specifically had a green stick fracture to the father's ninth rib.
They're tossing these. I mean, I should probably use this episode for students.
Yeah,
you should watch this. You should watch more of the series so you can talk about it in class. I'm surprised because you teach a forensic anthropology class, which is like the most popular course in the department. I'm surprised you're not more familiar with what your students are coming into a class with.
Oh my God, yeah. I was like CSI, you know, Miami with all the high heels and big décolletés, you know, like, how do you go chasing bad guys? Well, you put high heels on and you know, have the most revealing décolleté you can possibly, and you look great as well, right? I mean, otherwise you cannot be a FBI agent. Oh, gosh.
So green stick fractures occur when the bone is, usually it happens in young children. And so it's when the bone bends, but it doesn't actually break. And so it's generally seen in small children and is an indicator of trauma or child abuse, something like that. It wouldn't happen in an adult human bone from being stabbed with a spear. You would get a puncture wound. Not a green stick fracture.
But one of the things that really fascinated me is like when the crows finally cleaned the skeleton, right? The skeleton is...
This is the modern skeleton.
Yeah, the modern guy, you know, the archaeologist has finally cleaned off the maggots or whatever it is that they have there. And then his cervical spine is all together in a nice arch. It's like, that's not happening, right? It's like, how in the world? Like, it was hilarious. And then rib and femur of a Neanderthal male. I mean, talk about overinterpretation. Like, rib of a Neanderthal male, great. Like, fuck, I mean, you're good if you can recognize which rib it is, but to assign a species to it, it's just fantastic, you know?
Yeah, and the sex.
So with the girl, the hybrid girl child, they recognized that, so the parents were murdered and then the girl laid down with them and starved to death. And they know that she starved to death because of enamel hypoplasia.
Yeah, the rest lines, which is linear enamel hypoplasia. So when your teeth grow, you can think of it like a 3D printer where they grow up from the bottom and it builds up. And then if you go through a period of metabolic stress or physiological stress, and so your body doesn't want to waste its energy or resources on growing your teeth, it stops the growth of teeth or bones until you get healthy again. And you can that ends up leaving these linear lines that you can see in the teeth, again, rest stops. So it's linear enamel hypoplasia. But that wouldn't happen from starving to death because you would just die. You have to survive.
Living.
You have to survive the assault. Yes.
Yes, with linear enamel hypoplasia, because teeth are so genetically predetermined, right? They grow to their full height, but they don't have enough material to fill all the, you know, sort of matrix of the tooth with inorganic material or organic material. So they go and then they have these arrest lines. So they're very useful in paleoanthropology, but geez, like, you know, they don't tell you that someone starved to death because they don't develop when they starve to death.
No.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. And then they also said that the mom, the mom.
No, she doesn't talk much about
the modern human.
Much.
She died from a crushed larynx, which would not show on bones unless the cervical vertebrae were crushed. But then that would be a whole thing. That would just be a crushed neck, right? Like, if it's to the point that your cervical vertebrae are crushed, then...
Well, the hyoid bone could be broken for strangulation, but I believe we have one Neanderthal hyoid in the entire world that we've ever found.
It's
so
rare to
the
find
chances
even
that they're going to
human
find
hyoids.
a hyoid.
Like, in archaeological contexts, you can't find the hyoid. It's so delicate.
None of the modern human skeletons from Palaeolithic have a hyoid.
Yeah. Yeah, they're just very fragile. They're not found very often.
Okay, also they're missed by archaeologists when they dig them because they don't look human.
Yes. Yeah.
But you know, I was just recently learned that you can actually use hyoid in sexing. So the corners of the hyoid actually have a very different morphology between male and female.
Yeah, I think I've read that paper too. I don't think it's not something I've taught though.
That's
or used.
Pretty amazing actually. Because it's really like, I was looking at some examples that we have in the lab and I was like, whoa, this is true. How come never noticed? No one cared about hyoid for the longest time. Now it's all
but in
the
a forensic
rage.
situation where they're... Yeah, well...
I guess if you have a hyoid, you probably have a lot of other bones also preserved that can indicate sex better.
Yes, that is true. Unless there is dismemberment or something.
Yeah.
So one of the fun things about this episode is that Bones is the forensic anthropologist, but once she discovers that there's Neanderthal Paleolithic remains, she suddenly doesn't care about her forensic case and just wants to work on the Neanderthal case, which is very fun, I think.
Yeah.
But there's so much strange reasoning going on here that doesn't make any sense. She keeps insisting that once they find out that this Neanderthal and modern human family were murdered, she's like,
forensics.
It's a crime, therefore it's my job to figure it out. But like, it's not a crime. There were no laws.
No.
Also, it happened in Russia. It's not your jurisdiction as the FBI, right?
But she also said it was a crime because she put the parietal together.
Oh, but it's not a parietal, you know. She actually has a piece of occipital there.
It wasn't a parietal, but it was a occipital. So she puts it together. Then she says the parietal has a blunt force trauma. Therefore, this is murder. And you can knock your head and get blunt force trauma in many ways besides murder. So it was a huge leap to begin with.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. I mean, how they have reconstructed the crime is beyond belief, you know, like how then the two of them are like, I'm raising my hand, and then they twirl and twist, and it's hilarious, you know. You don't do that actually in science, no. It's actually about just about everything has some words that are from forensic anthropology, but none of them are used in a way we would normally do that.
No.
That's why I love this show, because there's so many little things. Every single thing they say is like, yes, I know what that means. You're slightly wrong.
It's like, how can you love that? It's annoying.
Yeah.
It's not just slightly wrong. It's out of focus entirely. You know, I marked my students down for overinterpretation because in the last exam, they have a mock scenario. I give them some descriptions and some stuff, and they have to make as much interpretation as they can. And usually it's like two individuals, and you can tell sex of at least one individual, and there's disparity in age. So there are clues that they can use to figure out what it is. But, you know, if they start off with, well, if we had dental remains, we could do this. And I'm like, you don't. This is all you have. Yeah. Make your case on this, right? And then if they go into crazy stuff like, oh, it's a Caucasoid male, you know, with a, you know, I don't know, Asian female based on 3 sentences, they get marked out. And they know it. They're very careful not to do it. In forensics, this is actually a serious issue because
it is.
If you overinterpret evidence, you can actually get someone in jail for non-crime, and you professionally, you really cannot do that.
Yeah, and leave a murderer out there, right? So it's not only just putting an innocent person behind bars, but it's also keeping someone who could do it again to hurt somebody else.
I don't know if you know the case of Dr. Charles, who was a forensic pathologist in Canada, and who put... Over 20 years, he put tons of people behind bars for a sudden infant death, and he was claiming that they were abusing children.
Yes.
And can you imagine a parent who actually had a kid die and then get abused, sued or accused of murdering them? Like, the whole life is ruined, you know. And then he was 20 years later, he was found to have given lots of inconclusive and false evidence to get these people.
Yeah, tragic.
That's like, and it's 20 years, you know, he could have done so much damage. So Bones, oh boy, not a good show.
No. Yes, better to say you don't know than to guess in a forensic situation.
What else did we notice? I don't remember anymore.
So my first favorite part was the licking the bones. My second favorite part was when they had just finally realized who the murderer was of the modern case, because they realized that there was remnants of traces of book binding material in the blunt force trauma or something. And so then she realized that it's the publisher, and she killed him with a bookend. So they go to the publisher's house. I know.
And then they find
And
blood
they go to the
on the
publisher's
floor.
house.
It's like,
They find blood everywhere, and then she's looking at her book collection. She's like, "It's really interesting, these books that you have. Here's this one on how to get away with the perfect murder. And look at this one, how to clean up a lot of blood." And you're like, that's the most ridiculous thing.
I don't know. It's like we have a saying, in Serbian, kako perica zamišlja nešto. How little Johnny thinks about, how a little Johnny would imagine one thing or another, That's probably the level of, how would I put that? Accuracy of this show, like a 5-year-old trying to imagine how it would work with a couple of words that are not in the repertoire of a 5-year-old.
We should also comment on the law and ethics around archaeology. So there's this guy who is not an archaeologist who has been excavating in Russia, obviously without a permit because he's not in Chechnya, obviously without a permit because he's not an archaeologist. He has smuggled these bones internationally, which is illegal because every country has laws surrounding its historical resources, and you can't dig them up without a permit. You can't take them across international borders without the right paperwork. Can't store them in a storage container. And then the FBI and the Smithsonian, not the Smithsonian, the Jeffersonian is what it's called in this show. They come in, they find them, and then the Jeffersonian is like, these are ours now. We're going to study them and make a museum display. None of this would happen. So first of all, the guy wouldn't be able to publish it because
no journal would ever accept that.
Yeah, the journal would have asked him how he got access to those bones, and he doesn't have permission to study them. So what would have happened is those bones should have gone straight back to Chechnya because nobody involved had the legal right to actually study those bones.
Yeah, well, that's a minor matter because Americans are known as upholding the laws their own way. But I mean, especially Fox News, I mean, come on. It's like... what do you expect from them? Like the Fox is, it's ridiculous actually. But just digging and blatantly, and then hoping that he can actually make a real archaeologist name for himself. Like that's 19th century, right? You don't do that anymore. It's not acceptable. Even in the 20th, it was not acceptable, and we are in 21st century. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's how most of the museums were built, right? They go there, they dig. I was just reading a history of China written by an American guy, and he's talking about these, German and American scientists going in, finding burials, and then taking all the documents out. And these documents are now in museums around the world, right? And you go like, that's not good. But what can you do?
I don't know. When you visit all the skeletal collections around the world, there's always one cupboard or something that has things that shouldn't be there, but the paperwork or the legality of repatriating them hasn't gone through yet or whatever.
Yeah. They're repatriating quite a lot of things now. And I know museums in Germany, like University of Tübingen Museum, for example, is very keen on finding the provenance of different skeletal parts and then finding the communities and then asking the communities if they want them back and how they want them handled. And so it's a long process. Good. It's not always easy to do that. And it's a lot of detective work.
No, it takes a lot of work and money.
Yeah. So you have to have money to begin with to steal lots of things, and then you have to have money to give them back.
And to return it.
Yeah. Okay, Josh, do you have any other tasks for us?
That's all my notes. Does anybody else have anything else to say?
I have nothing recorded in here except for this Neanderthal rib, which was fantastic. I mean, I just when I saw that, I was like, okay, yeah, not a tooth, not the skull, but a rib. Like, it's obvious, right?
I know. If for the listeners, there's people we argue over whether, a mandible or piece of a skull, which is way more diagnostic of species, is Neanderthal or not. So the idea that you'd be able to look at a rib where even in a modern human rib, I can't look at it and tell the difference between rib 6 and rib 7, or male versus female.
Yeah, but it's a Neanderthal male.
Yes, identify sex and species based on rib is pretty funny.
And then, I wrote something here, but I have such bad handwriting, I cannot read it. But based on the reconstruction, yeah. So my favorite part is that the illustrator is the one actually who illustrates it so well that he immediately points out, oh, no, this is a Neanderthal mixed child. That is the best part. I love that. Anyways, that's all I wrote. I mean, I have the linear animal hypoplasia, starved. It was ridiculous. Licking radius, all good things. But it was a short episode, but full of delightful inaccuracies, if you like that kind of thing. But she turns out a nice person afterwards. She lets him publish and put the name of the pseudo-archaeologist on his paper. And then
But then it doesn't make sense because she says she gives it. She takes her name off so his name could go on, but there's no limit to the amount of authors. Some papers have hundreds of authors. They could have all been authors on the paper.
I was on one which had 161 authors. I was like, what is your contribution to this paper? I was like, I checked one sentence, it was accurate. So it was it's an excellent paper, but I mean...
All right, so everybody is going to recommend that everybody go out and watch all 13 or 14 seasons of Bones to learn everything you need to know about forensic anthropology?
No.
Probably not, but I might use this one to point out, to ask students to analyze it and tell me all the problems with the forensic case here, because it's...
You should assign
I should assign it.
I've done that before, is I've assigned them to watch an episode of Bones and then write a paper as if they were the scientific consultant on it and how they would make everything change to make it more accurate, to make a worse show, really. But
this is fine. Okay, kiddos, thank you for having me in this episode. It was fun talking about Bones and watching it for once in my life. Once.
I don't want to do it again. I've seen it. I've done it. Now when someone asks me, I can say, yes, I've watched it.
Thanks for joining us. You're the first guest we've had on a second time on this podcast. You were on the Clan of the Cave Bear, which I think was episode 6, way back when we were starting out. So if anybody's listening, they can go back and check out that episode. If you've been enjoying Screens of the Stone Age, get in touch with us. Follow us on Twitter at SOTSA_podcast and on Facebook at SOTSA podcast, or send us an email to screensofthestonage@gmail.com. Screens of the Stone Age is supported by the Palaeoanthropological Society of Canada. Find out more at pasc-scpa.ca.